Hello and welcome to yet another M50 video. My name is Klaus Fransen and today we're gonna talk about picture profiles. So in the last video we talked about dynamic range and how the different picture profiles could affect this. More precisely the standard, the cine style, and this custom neutral, which is just a neutral profile with less contrast and more sharpening. Now, I had the Canon M50 for about 2 years now, and I just stuck with this custom neutral profile that was suggested by the Crowley crew, and it worked, and it worked well. I have been so happy with it, and I'm probably still gonna use it. But I've been a bit annoyed by myself for just following orders or suggestions by others, so I did the testing. I wanted to know what difference does it make choosing the right picture profile. And what I found is that the color, the sharpening, and the contrast are the main differences. Before I move on, I just want to explain what the picture profile basically is. And to put it super simple, it is like an Instagram filter that is baked into the file itself. It's like a LUT, it's like a picture profile, right? Now the issues with baking stuff into the video file is that it might be more difficult to retrieve the data or change it in post, and that's why a lot of people will say that log footage is superior to shooting in a already baked in look. Now, shooting in a flat profile will require more work in the editing. You need to grade it, you need to bring back the contrast, but you will get, for the most time, better results. But there is something that is called going too flat. If the files are not in a proper quality, and then you shoot in a super flat and then you grade it to a high degree, you want to change the colors, the look, everything, then you might run into trouble because the files from the M50 can only take so much. That's why the cinema cameras are used for cinema stuff. Their files are way more capable of being manipulated. Also, the Canon M50 shoots in 8-bit, meaning you only have about, 16 million colors opposed to 1 billion or something if you're shooting 10-bit, and that makes a huge difference when you want to color grade your footage. Now, that being said, you can still do wonders with 8-bit. So I tested all the picture profiles on the Canon M50 except for the monochrome, and I used the Ef-M 22mm f.20. I dialed the exposure in using the Ninja 5, so I had a perfect middle gray exposure. My settings were 25 frames per second, 1080, 100 ISO, f2.0, and at 1/50th of a shutter. And the only thing I then changed was the picture profiles. So yeah, I'm gonna talk about contrast, saturation, color accuracy, color consistency, and sharpness, because that's the main differences that I saw switching between all the profiles. And I just want to point out that the only thing I edited on the M50 footage was the white balance. And I suspect that my cheap light here have a bit of a green color cast because all my footage were a little bit to the green side. Apart from that, no grading have been done unless stated in the video. Alright, contrast. Overall, the picture profiles show very similar levels of contrast. I measured the RGB value of each gray and plotted it into Excel, but you can even see a difference in Da Vinci Resolve just by looking at this waveform monitor. The greater the distance is between the top and the bottom layer, the more contrast there is in the image. I usually set my middle gray at 512 and the white swatch at 896, and then the black swatch at 128. Based on these RGB values, I find that the landscape, standard, and the portrait picture profile as being the most contrasting. And interestingly enough, it is in the highlights that you see the difference. That means that your highlights will clip earlier in these picture profiles than in the others. The faithful, fine detail, and neutral profile are identical in terms of their contrast, but they do differ from landscape, standard, and portrait by having less bright whites. So this indicates that faithful, fine detail, and neutral have the most dynamic range, but only in the highlights. If we look at the custom neutral profile, which is at -4 in contrast, we'll see a small improvement in the dynamic range, as the darks gets brighter and the highlights gets darker. In other words, the curve is more flat. So this indicates that all picture profiles will benefit from a decrease in contrast if you want to achieve more dynamic range in your video. So as expected, the flat cine-style profile is much flatter and less contrasty than the rest. Actually, it appears to be as flat as the C-Log on my Canon EOS R. But please do notice that the clip I used for the comparison was shot for another video. Nonetheless, the cine-style is impressive when it comes to lifting the blacks and lowering the whites. Personally, I think it crushes the highlights a bit too much, but with a bit of editing it is definitely usable. So the takeaway point is, if you want to increase the dynamic range, decrease your contrast. If you want a well-edited image right out the box, then landscape, portrait and standard delivers a well-contrasted look as is. If you use faithful, neutral or fine detail, then you may need to lift your highlights in post. Okay, moving on to color. And I want to talk about the accuracy, the consistency and the saturation. But before I do so, I just want to make a few points, and that is that color is subjective to a certain degree. I'm using this color swatch or these color chips to be objective about the colors. And you may think or feel that some colors look nicer than others, and that is totally fine. Color science is a weird topic, but basically, if you do it right, you can manipulate the colors in post and get the look that you want. Let's start with the color consistency. And what I mean by that is how much does the colors change, changing from one picture profile to another. The best way to determine this is by looking at this combined vector scope. The colors are almost identical across the picture profiles. The only big changes I notice is in the blue and in the cyan. The overall accuracy of colors are somewhat true, apart from the cyan, magenta and yellow. However, the skin tones are where I usually end up when I'm grading my own footage. So this confirms that Canon have very pleasing colors, but not necessarily accurate colors. Naturally, we'll see that the cine style also is very desaturated. If you look at the landscape, it seems to be the most saturated profile, especially in the blue color space. So this is most likely meant for landscape shots. So if you desire a blue ocean or a very blue sky, then landscape will give you that in camera. The orange color space also seems to get a little bump, perhaps to enhance any golden hour shots. Portrait seems to bring more saturation towards the skin tones, the yellow, the orange and the red. Same thing applies to fine detail. Standard and faithful are both somewhat equally saturated with minor differences in the accuracy. So yeah, my overall comment is that the M50 is very much pushed towards this orange teal look. As you see, there's a lot of saturation in the yellows, around the skin tones, in the reds, and also around the teal look. So the cyan is pushed a bit more to the teal, so you get this nice Hollywood look with pleasing, popping skin tones. And you may hate it, you may love it, but that seems to be the goal Canon had in mind. Now let's take a look at sharpness. And this was a thing that surprised me a lot. I mean, this is probably where you find the biggest differences in the picture profiles. You're gonna have somewhat good colors and saturations in all the profiles, but the sharpness is a bit different. So for the other test we could use the mathematical tools in our video editor, but sharpness doesn't really have one specific tool that I can use. So this is all based on my personal view on my monitor before uploading it to YouTube. And I find that the fine detail appears to be the sharpest option, but portrait, landscape and standard is not far behind. So yeah, personally I find fine detail to be too sharp because it starts to get this digital sharpening look, so it just kind of looks like a bit fake. Where neutral and faithful are very soft, like all blurred out of focus, almost kind of soft. The cine style seems a bit sharper, but it is hard to tell because the contrast will also affect the perceived sharpness of the image. So sharpness can of course be added in post, But I really like the custom neutral profile that brings back just enough sharpness in camera, thus saving me an extra step in post. And I actually think that the in-camera sharpening by +2 in this neutral profile does a better job than a quick sharpening in DaVinci Resolve. I'm sure there are techniques that I'm not aware of that could improve this, but if I can do something in camera to get the look that I want in post, it helps my workflow, right? So yeah, I suggest you re-watch this video, find the picture profile that you think looks the best, that have the color profile that you like, the sharpening and the contrast, and then you start to tweak it a little bit. And I would suggest that you lower the contrast if you want more dynamic range, and I think you can do that in any of the picture profiles and still get great results. I would suggest that if you're using the neutral or faithful, that you add just about 2 in sharpening, and if you're using it on any of the other picture profiles, then lower them in sharpening by 1 or 2 stops. All right. So even though I use the custom neutral profile here on the M50 for basically everything, I would not use the normal ready to go neutral profile because I think it looks way too soft. And I really like how that bringing the contrast down, then adding contrast in post, also resaturates all the colors to a point that it just looks good. Basically all you have to do is add contrast and then tweak a little bit here and there for personal taste. So I'm a big fan of that. If I were to do something else, I think I would try the faithful, add more sharpening and decrease the contrast. Sort of like done in the custom neutral. I think that will give some really nice results as well. But my overall conclusion is that it doesn't really matter that much. So landscape is a bit of an extreme, fine detail is a bit of an extreme, but yeah, they're not that different. All right, that's all I have for today. I hope you learned something. I definitely did. And I'm curious to know what picture profile you've been using on the Canon M50 and which one did you prefer in this test. This was all I had for today. And if you want to learn how to change these settings in the picture profiles itself, I will make a new video, so make sure you subscribe. And I will also include how to install the CineStyle profile. And yeah, if you haven't already, check out my last video on the dynamic range and how it was affected by changing stuff like contrast. So yeah, that's all I have for today. Thank you for watching. My name is Claus Fransen, and that's where I'm gonna leave it. Bye!